She agreed to work at a farm where everyone claimed the dead mistress still roamed the halls, but what Sofia found in that place changed her destiny in a way no one could have imagined. Can you imagine being so rejected by society that you accept living isolated on a property that carries stories of hauntings just to have a roof over your head and a chance to start over? But this story happened in the rural heartland, in May of 1891, in an era when the judgment of others weighed heavier than any truth. Sofia Miller was only 24 years old when the world decided she didn't deserve a second chance. Her black mourning dress still smelled of mothballs and tears when her mother-in-law, Mrs. Martha, knocked on the door of the room Sofia had occupied for 8 months as a wife. The woman didn't waste time with pleasantries. She said Sofia needed to leave the house by the end of the week, as the place belonged to the family, and now that Thomas was dead, there was no reason for her to stay. Sofia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She asked if she could at least stay another month until she found work. Mrs. Martha replied that she had already waited too long, that the whole neighborhood was talking, that it wasn't right for a young widow to stay in a family home without a husband. Before you learn the title of this story, I have a small request. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. Drop your city and state down below. I love knowing that these stories reach so many different places in the US and around the world. And if you like stories of overcoming the odds and true love, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because we have new stories every week. Now let's continue, because Sofia and Edward's story is just beginning. The truth is, Sofia carried a burden no 24-year-old widow should have to bear. Thomas wasn't just her husband. He was the third man who had crossed her path and suffered misfortune. The first, Bernard, was a merchant's son who had asked for Sofia's hand when she was 19. 2 weeks before the wedding, his family called everything off, claiming they had received warnings that the union would be cursed. No one explained where these warnings came from. Sofia cried for weeks, but she moved on. The second, Leonard, was the village schoolteacher. They courted for 6 months. He was kind, patient, brought her flowers. But one Sunday morning, he vanished without explanation. Sofia learned later that his mother had fallen suddenly ill, and Leonard decided to return to the city, saying he couldn't abandon his family. She accepted it, though her heart ached. Then came Thomas. He was a simple man, worked hauling goods with his wagon. He didn't have Leonard's education or Bernard's money, but he had something Sofia desperately needed at that moment. He didn't believe in superstitions. When anyone mentioned the broken engagements, Thomas laughed and said that was nonsense for idle minds. They married in a small ceremony, just close family. Sofia thought she would finally have peace. But 8 months later, Thomas's wagon lost control on a steep decline. He died instantly, and that's when the whispers started. Pine Hollow was a small community where everyone knew everyone's business. The women gathered in the square after Sunday service, and the men talked at Mr. Oliver's general store. That was where the story took shape. They said Sofia was jinxed. They said any man who got close to her was destined to suffer. They said she must have some connection with dark forces, because it wasn't normal for 3 suitors in a row to meet with misfortune. Sofia heard it all in silence. She had no arguments. How do you prove you're innocent of something you don't even understand? The rejection came fast and heavy. At the general store, women turned their faces away when she entered. In church, they left the pews next to her empty. Mrs. Euler, who always bought her embroidery, stopped placing orders. She said, with a tone of fake pity, that it was better not to do business, to avoid trouble. Sofia tried to work as a seamstress from home, but no one knocked on her door anymore. The money Thomas had left, a little over $50, was running out. And when Mrs. Martha demanded she leave the house, Sofia realized she was completely alone. It was Mrs. Amelia, the village midwife, who offered a possibility. Sofia was in the square trying to sell some embroidery from a basket when the woman approached. Mrs. Amelia was known for fearing no one. She asked if Sofia was willing to leave Pine Hollow. Sofia replied she would do anything. The midwife then told her she knew someone who needed a seamstress. It was a large estate, Fairhaven Farm, more than 12 miles away. The owner was a widower, a serious man who lived isolated with his sister. The former seamstress had left to care for a sick mother, and they needed someone urgently. The pay was good, $25 a month, room and board included. Sofia felt a mix of hope and suspicion. She asked why no one from the region had taken the job if the conditions were so good. Mrs. Amelia hesitated before answering. She said the farm had a strange reputation. The farmer's wife had died there 3 years earlier, in sad circumstances, and since then people said the house was haunted. Some maids didn't last more than 2 weeks, claiming to hear footsteps at night, doors opening by themselves, shadows in the hallways. Sofia should have felt fear, but in that moment, facing the prospect of being homeless and penniless, even a haunted house seemed better than the public humiliation in Pine Hollow. The next day, Sofia packed her few clothes into a worn leather suitcase, packed the sewing box that had belonged to her mother, and the 3 books she owned. They were old volumes, gifts from her mother's employer, an aristocratic lady for whom she had worked as a companion before marrying. Sofia learned to read with those books. They were her treasure. Mrs. Amelia arranged a ride for her with a merchant heading toward the farm. The man was quiet, for which Sofia was grateful. She had no desire to talk. The journey took 3 hours. The dirt road was uneven, full of ruts that made the wagon rattle. Sofia held her suitcase tight and watched the landscape change. Pine Hollow was in an area of gentle hills with small plots. But as they moved further away, the terrain flattened out, with extensive pastures and thick woods in the background. The sky was heavy with grey clouds threatening rain. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. When they finally sighted Fairhaven Farm, Sofia held her breath. The property was imposing. A 2-story Victorian farmhouse, painted white with dark wood trim, surrounded by gardens that no longer saw the care they once did. The rose bushes were overgrown, the stone paths covered in dry leaves, but still the place maintained a melancholic beauty. 2 great oaks flanked the main entrance. There was an orchard to the left, and, further off, the barns and the bunkhouses where the workers lived. The merchant stopped in front of the house and helped Sofia down. He wished her luck with a look that said she would need it. Then he drove off, leaving Sofia alone before the massive wooden door. She took a deep breath and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed. No one answered. Sofia waited, her heart racing. She was about to knock again when the door opened. A tall woman, about 38, with brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, stared at her with a stern expression. She wore a simple but well-made grey dress. Her eyes were the same colour, cold as stone. It was Julianne, the farmer's sister. She asked if Sofia was the seamstress Mrs. Amelia had sent. Sofia confirmed with a steady voice, though she was trembling inside. Julianne examined Sofia from head to toe, noting the worn black dress, the old suitcase, the hands calloused from sewing. Finally she nodded and told her to enter. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior. The entrance hall had waxed wooden floors that creaked underfoot. There was a crystal chandelier on the ceiling, mahogany furniture, paintings on the walls. But everything carried a thin layer of dust and an air of abandonment, as if the house had stopped in time. Julianne led Sofia down a hallway to the back of the house, where the sewing room was located. It was a spacious room, with 3 large windows overlooking the orchard. It had a long table, a Singer sewing machine, shelves full of fabrics, threads, ribbons. Natural light poured in generously, making the room the most alive place in that entire somber house. Julianne explained the rules with a dry, direct voice. Sofia would work Monday to Saturday, from 7 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. She would have Sundays off. She would sleep in a small room attached to the sewing room. Meals would be taken in the kitchen with the other staff. She would sew clothes for the family, mend whatever was necessary, and occasionally make trousseaux for the daughters of the farmhands who were getting married. Payment would be made on the last day of the month. Julianne also made a point of making it clear that Sofia should not circulate through the house outside of work hours, should not ask unnecessary questions, and above all, should not bother her brother. Edward worked hard and did not like to be disturbed. Sofia agreed to everything. She wasn't in a position to question. Julianne then showed her the room. It really was small, barely fitting the narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a small table with a basin for washing her face. But it had a window that looked out onto the orchard, and when Sofia opened it, she felt the fresh air enter, bringing the scent of sweet plums. It was better than she expected, much better than sleeping on the street. Sofia arranged her few things, hung the black dress in the wardrobe, placed the books on the table. When she finished, she sat on the bed and, for the first time in weeks, cried with relief. It wasn't the fresh start she had dreamed of, but it was a start. The first week was hard. Sofia woke before dawn, washed her face in the cold water of the basin, pinned her hair in a simple bun, and went to the sewing room. Julianne left piles of clothes that needed mending, shirts with missing buttons, dresses that needed taking in, torn sheets. It was repetitive work, but Sofia did it all with care. She had learned since childhood that work well done was the only way to earn respect. Her mother always said that. While she sewed, Sofia heard the sounds of the farm, the lowing of cows, the shouts of the hands calling to one another, the sound of horses' hooves in the yard. But at night, the sounds changed. When everyone retired and silence took over, Sofia heard strange things, slow footsteps in the hallway, even knowing there was no one nearby, creaking in the floorboards. Once she woke in the middle of the night with the sensation that someone was watching her. She lit the candle and saw nothing, but her racing heart took a long time to calm down. She tried to convince herself that they were just the normal sounds of an old house. Wood expanding with the humidity, wind entering through the cracks. But the memory of the stories Mrs. Amelia had told about the haunted house returned, and Sofia had to make an effort to push away the fear. It was in the second week that Sofia saw Edward for the first time. She was in the sewing room, embroidering details on a tablecloth, when she heard the door open. She raised her eyes, and there he was, tall, broad shoulders, dark hair with grey strands at the temples, despite being only 32. He wore a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and dark trousers. He had deep brown eyes, tired, as if he carried an invisible weight. His face was serious, almost severe, but there was something gentle in the way he stopped at the door, as if silently asking permission before entering. Sofia stood up quickly, smoothing her dress nervously. Edward asked if she was the new seamstress. His voice was deep, deliberate. Sofia confirmed. He then explained that he needed new shirts for meetings with grain buyers. He had some fabric stored away, but needed them cut and sewn urgently. Sofia asked when he needed them. Edward replied in 2 weeks. She guaranteed they would be ready. He thanked her with a nod and was leaving when he stopped. He asked if she was settling in well. The question caught Sofia by surprise. No one had asked that. She said yes, that everything was fine. Edward looked at her a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something else, but just nodded again and walked away. That brief encounter stayed in Sofia's mind all day. There was something about Edward that was different from all the men she knew. He didn't have the arrogance of rich farmers. He didn't have the judgmental look the men in Pine Hollow had. There was a sadness in him that was visible. But there was also respect. He treated her like a person, not an invisible servant, and that, for Sofia, was more than enough to spark curiosity. In the following days, Sofia worked on Edward's shirts. She cut the fabric with precision, stitched the seams with perfect points, did the discreet embroidery on the cuffs. They were elegant shirts, for someone who understood quality. When she finished, she folded everything carefully and took them to Edward's study, as Julianne had instructed. She knocked on the door and waited. His voice told her to enter. Sofia opened the door and found herself in a room full of bookshelves, maps on the walls, a desk covered in papers. Edward was sitting, reviewing documents. He looked up when she entered. Sofia handed over the shirts. Edward examined them with attention. He ran his fingers over the embroidery, checked the seams, tested the buttons. Then he smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, but it completely changed his face. He said the work was impeccable, better than he expected. He asked where she had learned to embroider like that. Sofia explained that her mother had been a lady's companion, and she learned by watching the French embroidery her employer ordered. Edward seemed impressed. He commented that he knew that style, as his late wife also appreciated it. Her name escaped his lips with care, like someone touching an old wound. Amelia. Sofia sensed the pain that still inhabited that man. 3 years hadn't been enough to heal the loss. She knew that pain. It was the same she felt for Thomas. Even though their marriage had been short, Edward thanked her again and paid for the extra work, placing a few more coins than agreed. He said if she needed more fabric or thread, just ask Julianne. Sofia thanked him and was leaving when Edward called her. He asked what her name was. Sophia Miller, she replied. He repeated the name slowly, as if storing it away. Then he wished her a good afternoon and returned to his documents. From there, the meetings became more frequent. Edward began to appear in the sewing room with more regularity. Sometimes he brought fabrics that needed to become curtains, towels, bed linens. Other times, he simply stopped by to see how the work was going. Always polite, always respectful. But Sofia noticed he lingered a little longer than necessary. He would watch her sew, ask questions about the technique, about the different stitches. She answered, and gradually the conversation ceased to be just about sewing. Edward asked one day if she liked to read. Sofia said yes. He then offered to lend books from his library. She accepted with an enthusiasm she couldn't hide. He brought 3 volumes, a book of poetry, a collection of classic tales, and a history of the United States. Sofia devoured those books over the following nights. She read by candlelight until her eyes burned. When she returned them, Edward asked what she thought. Sofia gave honest opinions, cited passages that marked her, asked questions about contexts she didn't understand. Edward was visibly surprised. He commented that it was rare to find someone who read with such attention. From then on, a ritual was established. Every week he brought new books, and they talked about the previous ones. Julianne watched everything with growing suspicion. She told Edward one afternoon when Sofia was in the orchard picking plums that she didn't think it appropriate for him to pay so much attention to a hired hand. Edward replied calmly that he was just being kind, that there was no harm in lending books. Julianne retorted that people would talk. Edward asked what people, since they lived isolated. But his sister insisted. She said Sofia was a young widow, pretty, and could have ulterior motives. Edward became serious. He stated that Sofia wasn't that type, that anyone who spoke to her for 5 minutes would perceive her integrity. Julianne shook her head, dissatisfied, but didn't insist further. The truth Julianne didn't want to accept was simple. Edward was rediscovering something that had died along with Amelia 3 years prior. The desire to converse, the joy of sharing ideas, the lightness of having someone who understood his references. Amelia had been a cultured woman, a doctor's daughter, raised in the city before marrying Edward. she brought to the isolated farm a bit of the urban world, the soirees, the literary discussions. When she died of typhoid fever, Edward shut that part of himself down. He stopped reading for pleasure, stopped playing the piano, became only the farmer, the administrator, the businessman. But Sofia, unintentionally, without planning, was opening that door again. And Sofia, for her part, was feeling something she swore never to feel again. When Edward entered the sewing room, her heart raced. When he smiled in that restrained way, she had to look away so as not to let the emotion show. When he came close to see the embroidery, and she smelled the scent of tobacco and leather he carried, it took concentration to keep her hands steady on the sewing. She knew it was dangerous. She knew a poor, scandal-ridden widow had no right to dream of a rich, respected farmer, but the heart doesn't ask permission to feel. One afternoon in June, 3 months after Sofia arrived at the farm, something happened that would change everything. It was raining hard. It was one of those summer storms that turned the earth to mud and made the creeks overflow. Sofia finished the day's work and went to her room. She lit the candle, took the book Edward had lent her, and lay down to read. She was so concentrated she didn't notice when the rain began to blow in through the window she had left ajar. She only realized when she heard the sound of something falling. She jumped up, startled, and saw that the water had soaked the 3 books she kept on the small table. Her books, the only valuable possessions she had. Sofia tried everything to save them. She dried the pages with cloths, left them open to air out. But the damage was done. The pages warped, the ink on some blurred. She sat on the floor and cried. It wasn't just for the books, it was for everything. For the exhaustion of carrying the injustice, for the loneliness, for the longing for her mother who died when she was only 16, for the fear of never truly being happy. She cried until she had no more tears. When she finally calmed down, she wiped her face, gathered the books, and promised herself she would find a way to restore them, even if it took years. The next day, Edward appeared in the sewing room later than usual. He carried a package wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to Sofia, saying he had managed to get new copies of the books she liked most. He had noticed how she cared for them and imagined she would be happy. Sofia was speechless. They were exactly the 3 books that had belonged to her mother. Edward had managed new copies, probably ordering them from the city. She held the books against her chest, eyes welling up. She tried to thank him, but her voice failed. Edward understood. He said only that she deserved to have good things, and then he added something that made Sofia's heart stop for an instant. He said he admired her strength, the way she rebuilt her life even after so much loss. Sofia looked into his eyes and saw something there that scared and moved her at the same time. There was more than admiration. There was affection. There was interest. Edward realized he had revealed too much. He took a step back, wished her good work, and left quickly. Sofia stood still, holding the books, feeling that something irreversible had just happened between them. And outside, hidden behind a door, Julianne had seen and heard everything. And what she saw did not please her one bit. In the following weeks, Julianne completely changed her demeanor. Before she was cold but professional. Now she became vigilant. She appeared in the sewing room without warning, checked Sofia's work with a critical eye, looking for defects that didn't exist. She asked questions about where Sofia was, who she talked to, what she did during her breaks. Sofia felt the weight of that suspicion, but didn't completely understand the reason. She had done nothing wrong, just accepted borrowed books and talked about literature. But for Julianne, that was more than enough to set off all alarms. Edward's sister had her reasons. Amelia, the late wife, had been more than a sister-in-law to her. She had been her best friend. The two grew up together, studied together, shared dreams. When Amelia died, Julianne didn't just lose a sister-in-law. She lost the sister she never had by blood, but had by choice. She swore that day, beside the fresh grave, that she would protect Edward from any woman who tried to occupy Amelia's place. And now she saw in Sofia a real threat, a young, beautiful, intelligent widow who was clearly winning her brother's attention. Julianne began to ask discreet questions to the staff. She wanted to know more about Sofia, where she came from, why she left the previous village, what her story was. The foreman, Mr. Ben, a man trusted by the family for over 20 years, said he didn't know much, only that Sofia was a recent widow and that widow Amelia, the midwife, had recommended her. But Julianne wasn't content with so little. She decided to go to Pine Hollow to investigate on her own. The trip took half a day. Julianne took the smaller buggy and went alone, telling Edward she was going to visit an old acquaintance. She arrived in Pine Hollow on a cold, grey July afternoon. The village was small, houses clustered around the central square where the church stood. Julianne stopped at Mr. Oliver's general store, knowing stores were always centres of gossip. She bought a few yards of ribbon and let slip in a casual conversation that she was looking for information about a seamstress named Sofia Miller. The effect was immediate. The store owner's wife, Mrs. Kitty, a woman of about 50 with a quick tongue, approached with eyes shining with curiosity. She asked why Julianne wanted to know about that girl. Julianne said Sofia worked at her farm and she wanted to know more about her past. Mrs. Kitty then leaned in and began to tell. She said Sofia was a widow, yes, but not a common widow. She was cursed. 3 men who got involved with her had bad luck. The last one, Thomas, had died in a suspicious accident. There were those who said Sofia had a pact with dark forces. That was why no one in Pine Hollow wanted anything to do with her. Julianne listened to it all with a neutral expression, but inside she felt a mix of confirmation and alarm. Her suspicions were right. Sofia wasn't just an innocent widow. She was a woman who brought trouble. Mrs. Kitty added that if Julianne was smart, she would send Sofia away before some tragedy happened. Julianne thanked her for the information, bought a few more things to disguise her intent, and left. The trip back was made in tense silence. She mentally rehearsed the conversation she would have with Edward. That same night, after dinner, Julianne asked to speak with her brother in the library. Edward was tired after a full day supervising the corn harvest, but agreed. They sat in the leather armchairs near the fireplace where a low fire burned. Julianne was direct. She told him about the trip, about what she had discovered, about the stories running through Pine Hollow. She said Sofia wasn't trustworthy, that there was something strange in her past, that 3 men had suffered misfortunes linked to her. Edward listened to everything in silence, his face growing more closed. When Julianne finished, expecting her brother to agree immediately to dismiss Sofia, he surprised her. He asked if she really believed in curses and superstitions. Julianne replied it wasn't a question of belief, but of reputation. They said Sofia attracted bad luck, so it was better not to risk it. Edward shook his head. He said he had known Sofia for months, that he had spoken at length with her, that he saw her character. Those stories were just gossip from small-minded people who needed to invent explanations for coincidences. Julianne insisted, said it was dangerous for him to get too close to a hired hand, especially one with a dubious past. Edward then did something rare. He raised his voice. He said his personal life was not Julianne's business, that he would treat Sofia as he saw fit, and that he didn't want to hear about it anymore. His tone frightened Julianne. She had never seen her brother like that. He had always been calm, thoughtful, respectful. But now there was fire in those eyes. She realized in that moment she had arrived too late. Edward was already emotionally involved. Maybe he didn't admit it yet, even to himself, but Julianne saw it clearly. He was falling in love with Sofia, and that for her was unacceptable. Meanwhile, Sofia knew nothing. She continued her routine of work, waking early, sewing during the day, reading at night. She noticed Julianne was colder, but imagined it was just the mistress's difficult temperament. Edward continued appearing in the sewing room, but something had changed between them since the day of the books. There was tension in the air, greater care with words, an awareness that they were treading on dangerous ground. It was on an August afternoon, when the sun streamed through the sewing room windows, creating golden patterns on the floor, that Edward finally crossed the invisible line that separated them. Sofia was embroidering an altar cloth ordered by Reverend Vincent for a church in a neighboring village. The work was delicate, requiring total concentration. Edward entered and watched in silence for a few minutes. Then he asked if she didn't get tired of working so much. Sofia smiled, without taking her eyes off the embroidery, and replied that she liked what she did. The work kept her busy, kept her mind away from sad thoughts. Edward asked about those sad thoughts. Sofia hesitated. She didn't usually talk about herself, but something in his voice, in the way he asked with genuine interest, made her open up. She told him about the mother she lost early, about how she felt lost after that. She told him about the broken engagements, about how that destroyed her confidence. She told him about Thomas, about how the marriage had been brief but represented hope, and she told him about the loneliness that came after, about how Pine Hollow had turned her into a pariah. Edward listened to everything without interrupting. When she finished, voice choked with emotion, he did something unexpected. He reached out and lightly touched her shoulder. It was a brief, respectful touch, but it carried so much emotional weight that Sofia felt as if an electric current crossed her body. Edward said he was deeply sorry for what she had been through. He said no person deserved to be judged for coincidences they didn't control. He said he saw in her a woman of rare strength, of admirable integrity, and then he added, voice lower, that he felt privileged to know her. Sofia raised her eyes and met his gaze. There was everything that couldn't be said in words. The attraction, the interest, the beginning of something bigger. Now I want to make a quick request. If you are enjoying this story, leave a like down below. This helps the channel grow a lot and shows me that you want more stories like this. Let's continue. The moment was interrupted by hurried footsteps in the hallway. Edward pulled away quickly. Julianne entered the sewing room with a tense expression. She said an important visitor had arrived. Mrs. Constance, matriarch of one of the most influential families in the region. Edward sighed, annoyed. He didn't like visitors, especially Mrs. Constance. The woman was known for sticking her nose where it wasn't wanted, but out of politeness, he couldn't refuse. He excused himself to Sofia and left. Julianne cast an icy look at her before following her brother. Mrs. Constance was a woman of 60, elegant, who always dressed impeccably, even living in the country. A widow for 10 years of a National Guard colonel, she maintained the title and influence of her late husband. She had 3 children, the youngest, Augustus, being her darling. He was a young man of 28, handsome but without a defined profession, who lived off his mother. Mrs. Constance had arrived accompanied by him. They sat in the parlour. The maid served coffee and biscuits. Mrs. Constance didn't waste time with pleasantries. She said she had come to discuss a delicate matter. She had heard rumours that Edward was employing a woman of dubious reputation, a widow from Pine Hollow who carried a bad name. She was worried. As an old friend of the family, she thought it her duty to alert him. Edward felt anger rise, but kept his tone polite. He replied that his employee was an exemplary worker and the rumours had no foundation. Mrs. Constance insisted. She said she had reliable sources. 3 men linked to that woman had suffered misfortunes. It wasn't prudent to keep someone like that nearby. Augustus, who until then had remained silent, agreed with his mother. He added that he had heard worse stories. They said the woman used charms to seduce men, then destroyed them. Edward felt like throwing the two out, but Julianne intervened. She said she was aware of the situation and had already spoken to her brother about it. Mrs. Constance then suggested it was better to dismiss the girl before something bad happened. Edward, his patience already exhausted, thanked them for their concern, but said he would not change his decision. When the visitors finally left, Edward was furious. He told Julianne he wouldn't accept them speaking that way about Sofia. Julianne retorted that he was being blind, that people commented because there were reasons. Edward replied that people comment because they like to destroy other people's lives. That discussion ended badly, with Edward going up to his room and slamming the door, something he never did. Sofia found out about the visit through Marina, the cook. The 40-year-old woman liked Sofia and used to share the household news. She said Mrs. Constance had come to speak ill of her, but that the boss had defended her. Sofia felt a mix of gratitude and worry. She didn't want to cause trouble for Edward. He already carried enough weight. She decided it was better to keep her distance, avoid giving reasons for more gossip. In the following days, Sofia began to avoid Edward. When he appeared in the sewing room, she concentrated on work and gave short answers. She didn't accept borrowed books anymore. Edward noticed the change but didn't understand the reason. He was confused, hurt. He thought perhaps he had been too invasive, that the touch on her shoulder had crossed boundaries. He began to torture himself, decided to respect her distance. But destiny had other plans. One September morning, Edward needed to go to Fairview City, a larger town 2 days' travel away, to settle urgent business with grain exporters. He usually went alone, but this time the foreman had fallen ill, and the farm accountant couldn't go either. Edward needed someone who could read, write, and do figures to help with the contracts. That was when Julianne, wanting to prove a point, suggested sarcastically that perhaps Sofia could go, since she was so cultured. Edward took the suggestion seriously. He asked Sofia if she knew how to do figures. Sofia confirmed. Her mother, being a lady's companion, had taught her basic math and household accounting. Edward then made the formal invitation. He needed someone to assist him on the trip, help review contracts and take notes. It would be a 4-day trip, round trip. Sofia would stay at a respectable boarding house in Fairview City and would be duly remunerated for the extra service. Sofia knew she should refuse. A widow traveling alone with a single man would give even more ammunition for gossip. But the opportunity to leave the farm, to see a bigger city, to be useful in a different way, was too tempting. She accepted. Julianne was shocked that Edward actually took her sarcastic suggestion forward. She tried to argue it wasn't appropriate, but Edward said he was decided. He needed help, and Sofia was qualified. They would travel with all propriety. Period. Julianne realized she had made a mistake. Instead of pushing the two apart, she had just created the perfect opportunity to bring them even closer. They left on a fresh morning. Edward drove the buggy pulled by 2 strong horses. Sofia sat beside him, wearing her least worn dress, hair tied in a simple bun, a shawl over her shoulders to protect against the cold. The road was long, passing through hills, valleys, small villages. Edward pointed out landmarks, told stories about the region. Sofia listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions. Conversation flowed naturally, without the barriers they had built in recent weeks. They stopped for lunch at a ranch by the roadside. They ate bread, cheese, and sausage Marina had prepared, drank fresh water from a nearby creek. There, sitting on a large rock under the shade of a century-old oak tree, away from judgmental eyes, they could be just 2 people talking. Edward asked what Sofia wanted for the future. She replied she wanted to have her own sewing shop one day, employ other women, teach the trade. Edward said he thought that was admirable. He asked if she thought about marrying again. Sofia became serious. She said she didn't believe anyone would want to marry her after everything they said. Edward then said something that changed everything. He said any man of good sense would feel fortunate to have someone like her by his side. Sofia looked at him, heart racing. She asked if he really believed that. Edward held her gaze and confirmed. He said he knew her character, saw her strength, admired her resilience, and that nothing they said changed what he saw with his own eyes. They were so close, Sofia could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, the small scar near his eyebrow, the way his lips curved when he spoke. She felt the urge to touch his face, but restrained herself. She thanked him softly for the words. Edward seemed to want to say more, but stood up abruptly, saying they needed to continue the journey. They arrived in Fairview City in the late afternoon. It was a real city, with wide streets, two-story houses, shops, a hotel, even a theatre. Sofia was amazed. Edward took her to Mrs. Flora's boarding house, a respectable establishment run by a widowed lady. He got Sofia settled in a clean, comfortable room, paid in advance, and recommended she rest. He would stay at the hotel nearby. Tomorrow, business would begin. The meeting was at the exporter's house, Mr. Martin, a Portuguese man established in the country for 30 years. Edward needed to close a contract for the sale of 3,000 bushels of wheat. The terms were complex, involving price per bushel, discounts for quality, delivery deadlines, penalties for delay. Mr. Martin had brought a lawyer and an accountant. Edward had Sofia. She sat discreetly in a corner of the room with paper and pencil, noting every number, every clause. Edward consulted her with his eyes whenever a doubt arose about calculations. She did the math quickly, showed the results. Mr. Martin was impressed with the young woman's efficiency. At the end of the negotiation, which lasted 4 hours, they closed a deal advantageous for both sides. Mr. Martin congratulated Edward on his competent assistant. Edward thanked him and said he was lucky to have Sofia working with him. The pride in his voice saying that made Sofia feel valued in a way she had never felt before. Thomas never publicly acknowledged her capabilities. Other suitors barely knew she had an education, but Edward wasn't ashamed to admit he depended on her, that she was useful, intelligent, necessary. After the meeting, Edward invited Sofia for dinner at a restaurant. She hesitated, saying she didn't have appropriate clothes. He said she was perfect as she was. They sat at a table near the window, ordered roast beef with potatoes, red wine. Conversation flowed easily. They talked about the day's business, about the city, about future plans. Edward told of his dream to expand grain production, maybe invest in processing. Sofia suggested ideas on how to better use the fabrics produced on the farm, perhaps create a line of products to sell in neighboring towns. He listened with attention, asked questions, developed her ideas. It was an intellectual partnership rare marriages had. When they returned to the boarding house, it was already night. The street was quiet, lit by gas lamps. Edward walked Sofia to the door. They stood there, neither wanting to say goodbye. Edward finally said he had greatly appreciated her company. Sofia replied she had too. He asked if she was happy working at the farm. Sofia said yes, happier than she imagined possible when she left Pine Hollow. Edward seemed satisfied with the answer. He wished her good night. He was turning away when Sofia called him. She wanted to thank him for everything. For treating her with respect, for trusting her, for defending her when others spoke ill. Edward came back, stepped close. He said she didn't need to thank him, that he did only what was right, and that he was starting to realize Sofia wasn't just an exceptional employee. She was someone he admired deeply, as a person, as a woman. The air between them became charged. Sofia could barely breathe. Edward raised his hand slowly, as if giving her time to retreat. He touched her face lightly, thumb brushing her cheekbone. They stayed like that for seconds that felt eternal. Then Edward pulled back, as if remembering where they were. He wished her good night again, this time with a husky voice, and walked away quickly. Sofia entered her room with trembling legs, leaned against the closed door. and brought her hand to her face where she still felt the warmth of his touch. The trip back was different. There was a new awareness between them. An unspoken promise. They talked less, but the silences were comfortable. Edward took her hand once to help her up into the buggy and took seconds longer than necessary to let go. Sofia felt she was falling off a cliff, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to fall. When they arrived at the farm, reality awaited them. Julianne received them with a closed face. She said there had been visitors during their absence. Mrs. Constance had returned, bringing more people this time. She had spread throughout the region that Edward was having a scandalous affair with a cursed employee. Respectable families were starting to avoid business with Fairhaven Farm. 2 suppliers had cancelled contracts, claiming discomfort with the situation. Edward went pale with rage. He said Mrs. Constance had no right to interfere in his life. Julianne replied that Constance was only saying what everyone already thought, that it was scandalous for a widowed man of his position to get involved with a poor, ill-reputed seamstress, that it would destroy the family's reputation. Edward said he didn't care about reputation. Julianne then played her final card. She asked if he was willing to dishonor Amelia's memory for a whim. That hit Edward in the chest. He fell silent, struggling with the guilt he carried. Sofia witnessed part of the argument before retreating to her room. She heard enough to understand her presence was causing serious problems. That night, lying in her narrow bed, she made a decision. She couldn't stay. She was in love with Edward, that was undeniable. But love didn't pay bills or rebuild reputations. He deserved someone of his social level, someone who didn't bring complications. In the morning, she would seek Edward out and resign. But destiny had other plans. In the early hours, Sofia woke to the smell of smoke. She got up startled and saw an orange glow through the window. The storage barn was on fire. She ran outside screaming. The workers woke up, came running with buckets. Edward appeared in minutes, organizing the firefighting. Everyone worked together for hours. When they finally managed to control the flames, the barn was destroyed. Half the wheat harvest, ready to be sold, had turned to ash. Edward was devastated. That loss represented months of work and a good part of the annual revenue. Mr. Ben, the foreman, inspected what remained and found something disturbing. The fire wasn't accidental. Someone had poured kerosene on the back of the barn and lit it. It was sabotage. The news spread through the farm. Edward gathered all the workers, asked if anyone saw anything suspicious. No one knew anything. But Marina, the cook, pulled Sofia aside and whispered something that made her blood run cold. She had seen a man prowling the farm the previous afternoon, a well-dressed young man who didn't seem to be from the region. He had asked about Sofia, where she slept, if she was really there. Marina thought it strange, but didn't give it importance at the time. Now she thought she should tell. Sofia felt a chill down her spine. She asked what the man looked like. Marina described him. Tall, light hair, honey-colored eyes, expensive clothes. Sofia recognized him immediately. Augustus, Mrs. Constance's son. But why would he be prowling the farm? Why ask about her? And could he have something to do with the fire? The pieces of a puzzle Sofia didn't even know existed began to fit together in her mind. Augustus. That name had appeared before in her life, though she had never given it importance. He lived in Pine Hollow when she still lived there. He was a few years older. Sofia vaguely remembered him looking at her in church, but they never spoke. Was it possible he had something to do with her suitor's misfortunes? That possibility was too frightening to consider alone. Sofia sought Edward out. She found him in the library, sitting before the desk covered in bills and documents, calculating the loss. She told him what Marina had seen about Augustus. Edward grew tense. He said he couldn't accuse without proof, but he didn't trust the young man. Mrs. Constance had spoiled her son so much he had become a man without character. But causing arson was too serious. They needed proof before making any accusation. Sofia then revealed her suspicions about the past. She told him Augustus lived in Pine Hollow when the misfortunes happened. Edward heard everything with growing concern. He said he needed to investigate, talk to the right people, maybe even involve the authorities, but he asked Sofia to be careful. If Augustus really was obsessed with her to the point of sabotaging suitors and now the farm, he was dangerous. That night, Edward placed 2 trusted workers to watch the house and the barns. He wouldn't take any more risks, and for the first time since Amelia died, he felt true fear. Not for himself, but for Sofia. He realized in that moment she meant more to him than just admiration or passing interest. He was in love, completely. And the idea that someone could hurt her made him desperate. Sofia, for her part, couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to every sound, every creak. She thought of Edward, his touch on her face, the words he had said. She thought of Augustus, the possibility that he had destroyed her life out of a sick obsession. She thought of Thomas, whose death perhaps hadn't been an accident. And she thought of the future, uncertain and scary, but for the first time in years also full of hope, because now she had someone by her side, someone who believed in her, someone who would fight for her. And outside, hidden in the woods surrounding the farm, Augustus watched the lit window of Sofia's room. His eyes shone with something that wasn't love. It was obsession. And he wouldn't let Edward, the farmer, steal what he considered his by right. Edward didn't wait for dawn. As soon as the first grey light appeared on the horizon, he mounted his horse and left for Pine Hollow. He took Mr. Ben with him, as the foreman knew people in all the villages of the region and knew how to ask the right questions. The trip was made in silence, each lost in thought. Edward felt urgency burning in his chest. He needed to discover the truth, not just to protect Sofia, but to free her from the invisible chains that bound her to the past. They arrived in Pine Hollow when the sun was already high. The village was waking up slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, chickens scratching in the dirt street. Edward went straight to the clerk's office. The notary, Mr. Eugene, a middle-aged man with round spectacles, recognized Edward immediately. Important families were always remembered. Edward explained he needed to consult old records, specifically the file on the accident that killed Thomas Miller 3 years earlier. Mr. Eugene was surprised but didn't question. He fetched the archived documents. Edward read everything with attention. The report said Thomas's wagon lost control on a steep decline. The front left wheel had come off, causing it to overturn. Thomas had broken his neck, instant death. It was considered an accident due to mechanical failure. But there was a detail that caught Edward's attention. A witness mentioned quickly in the report. A man who was near the scene and helped recover the body. The name wasn't complete, just initials. AF. Edward felt his heart race. Augustus Fletcher. Let's give him a last name. Fletcher. Mr. Ben suggested they look for the village blacksmith, Master Joe. If anyone knew about wagons and accidents, it was him. They found the blacksmith in his shop, hammering red-hot iron. When Edward asked about Thomas's accident, the man stopped working and wiped sweat from his forehead. He said he remembered well. He had been called to inspect the wagon wreckage. The wheel that had come off had the bolts removed. Not loosened by natural wear, removed intentionally. He had mentioned this at the time, but no one wanted to investigate. Thomas was poor. The widow had no influential family, so the case was filed as an accident. Edward felt anger boil. He asked if the blacksmith would remember to testify to this officially. Master Joe said yes, but needed guarantees he wouldn't suffer reprisals. Edward guaranteed protection. The blacksmith then added something else. He said the week before the accident, He saw Augustus Fletcher prowling the area where Thomas used to leave the wagon during deliveries. He thought it strange at the time, but didn't give it importance. Now he realized he should have spoken up. Mr. Ben suggested they talk to more people. They went to the house of Mrs. Amelia, the midwife who helped Sofia. The woman received them with herbal tea and homemade cookies. When Edward asked about Sofia's broken engagements, Mrs. Amelia sighed deeply. She said she always knew there was something wrong with those stories. Sofia was a good girl, hard-working. It didn't make sense to have so many misfortunes. She told that Bernard, the first fiancé, received anonymous letters saying Sofia had a contagious disease. The letters came with details so specific his family believed them. As for Leonard, the teacher, she heard say someone threatened his sick mother, saying bad things would happen if the marriage proceeded. Leonard fled in fear. Edward asked who could have done this. Mrs. Amelia hesitated, but finally said what everyone seemed to know, but no one wanted to say. Augustus Fletcher. The boy was obsessed with Sofia since he saw her for the first time, when she was 19. But Sofia never paid him any attention. He came from a rich family, could have any girl, but wanted precisely the one who didn't want him. The obsession grew when Sofia accepted other suitors. Augustus couldn't stand being rejected. So he began to sabotage. Mrs. Amelia said she tried to alert Sofia at the time, but the girl was so devastated by the broken engagements she couldn't listen. And after Thomas died, Sofia simply wanted to flee that place. Edward had the pieces now, but he needed documentary proof, something he could present publicly. Mr. Ben then had an idea. He said he knew the former housekeeper of the Fletcher household. The woman had been dismissed 6 months ago after an argument with Mrs. Constance. If anyone knew the secrets of that family, it was her. Her name was Louise, and she lived with her daughter in a small house on the outskirts of the village. They found Mrs. Louise hanging clothes on the line. She was a woman of 50, grey hair, hands misshapen by hard work. When she learned Edward wanted information about Augustus, she almost refused. She was afraid of Mrs. Constance, but Edward promised financial compensation and protection. The woman then relented. She went into the house and returned with a wooden box. Inside were letters. Letters Augustus had written to Sofia over the years and never sent. Letters where he declared obsessive love, spoke about how he drove away the competitors, how Sofia would one day understand they were destined. There was also a diary where he detailed every sabotage, how he removed the bolts from Thomas's wagon, how he sent the anonymous letters about Bernard, how he threatened Leonard's family. Edward felt sick reading it. It wasn't love, it was sickness, destructive obsession. And Sofia had suffered years because of it, carrying guilt that was never hers. Mrs. Louise explained she found the box hidden in Augustus's room when doing a deep clean. She was horrified, but didn't know what to do. When she was dismissed, she took the box with her, thinking one day it might be useful. Edward paid the woman a generous amount and asked her to testify if necessary. She agreed. They returned to the farm in the late afternoon. Edward entered the house with the box under his arm and a determined expression. He found Julianne in the living room embroidering. He showed the letters and diary to her, read passages aloud. Julianne went pale, put her hand to her mouth. There was no way to deny the evidence before her eyes. Augustus was responsible for everything. Sofia was innocent. Edward said he would see justice done. He would seek the sheriff, present the evidence, see Augustus punished. And more importantly, he would clear Sofia's name publicly. But before doing anything, he needed to talk to Sofia. He found her in the sewing room, stitching by the dim light of a candle. She stood up, seeing him enter, eyes questioning. Edward placed the box on the table and told her everything, showed the letters, the diary, explained every discovery. Sofia listened with an expression of growing shock. When he finished, she collapsed into a chair, trembling. It wasn't her fault. It never was. 3 years carrying unjust accusations, 3 years believing that maybe there really was something wrong with her, and now she discovered she was the victim of a sick man who destroyed her life for not accepting rejection. Sofia began to cry, not from sadness, but from relief. Edward knelt before her, held her hands in his. He said he would prove her innocence to the whole world, that Augustus would pay for what he did, that she would be free. Sofia looked at him through tears. She asked why he was doing all that for her. Edward took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. He said he did it because he loved her. Simply that. He loved her strength, her intelligence, her kindness, her resilience. He loved everything she was, and he didn't care what the world said. He wanted Sofia by his side, if she would accept. Sofia couldn't answer with words. She just pulled Edward close, and for the first time, allowed herself to feel everything she had been repressing. They embraced there, in the candlelit sewing room, while outside, night fell over Fairhaven Farm. It was the beginning of something new, something true. The next day, Edward went to the nearest town's police station. He presented all the evidence to Sheriff Davis, an honest man known for not bowing to political pressure. The sheriff read everything with growing attention, called the clerk, ordered a formal complaint filed, said he would issue an arrest warrant for Augustus Fletcher for manslaughter, sabotage, and stalking. Edward thanked him, but he knew just the arrest wouldn't be enough to clear Sofia's name. He needed something more public, something that forced society to recognize the mistake. The opportunity came a week later. It was time for the Harvest Festival, an annual event that gathered all the important families of the region. It happened in the main square of Fairview City, central among the farms. There was a church service, an auction of produce, a dance. It was the most important social event of the year. Edward decided it would be there, in front of everyone. He would clear Sofia's name and make his proposal. Julianne tried to dissuade him. She said causing a scene at the party would only make things worse. But Edward was decided. For the first time in 3 years since Amelia died, he felt true purpose, not just as a farmer, but as a man, and he was willing to face any consequence. On the day of the party, Sofia was nervous. Edward had insisted she go, had bought her a new dress of dark blue fabric with lace details. Sofia got ready with care. Julianne, surprisingly, helped. Edward's sister had had time to process everything she discovered. The evidence was undeniable. Sofia was a victim, not a villain. And more importantly, Julianne saw the way Edward had changed in recent weeks. He smiled again. There was light in his eyes. That hadn't happened since before Amelia's death. Julianne realized she was being selfish, trying to keep her brother tied to the past. Amelia wouldn't come back, but life continued, and if Edward found happiness with Sofia, she had no right to destroy it. They arrived at the party in the late afternoon. The square was decorated with colorful banners, tables full of food, well-dressed people circulating. When Edward entered with Sofia by his side, conversations stopped. Shocked looks, whispers. Mrs. Constance was near the platform where the auction would happen. She turned livid seeing Sofia. She approached quickly, said loudly enough for everyone to hear that it was a disrespect for Edward to bring that woman to an event for respectable families, that Sofia wasn't welcome there. Edward waited for her to finish. Then, with a firm and clear voice, he replied that Sofia was more respectable than half the people present, that she had been the victim of a terrible injustice, and that he would prove it now. He pulled the letters and diary he carried from his satchel, began to read passages aloud. The silence that fell over the square was absolute. People listened horrified to Augustus's confessions. How he sabotaged Sofia's suitors, how he caused Thomas's death, how he stalked Sofia for years. Mrs. Constance tried to interrupt, saying they were lies, but Edward called Mrs. Louise, the former housekeeper, who was present as arranged. The woman confirmed everything. Said she found those documents in the Fletcher house. Master Joe, the blacksmith, also stepped forward, confirmed that Thomas's accident was sabotage. Other people began to speak, shared old suspicions they never had the courage to vocalize. The weight of the truth was crushing. Mrs. Constance tried to defend her son, but even she knew there was no defense possible. Augustus, who was present, tried to flee, but Sheriff Davis had arrived earlier as Edward requested. He arrested Augustus right there, in front of everyone. The young man shouted he did it all for love, that Sofia should be grateful, that he saved her from men unworthy of her. The delusional speech only confirmed his guilt. Before I sign off now, I want to ask you one thing. If this story is touching your heart, share it with someone you think will like it. Let's continue. After Augustus was taken away, Edward asked for everyone's attention. He stepped onto the platform, said he wanted to make a public declaration. The whole square was attentive. He began speaking about justice, how Sofia suffered unjust accusations for years, how she carried guilt that was never hers, how she was rejected by society without having committed any crime. And then he changed his tone, said he met Sofia months ago, that he discovered in her a woman of exemplary character, intelligent, hard-working, honest, strong, said he learned to admire her, then to respect her, and finally to love her. Murmurs started up again, but Edward continued. He said he didn't care about social differences, that Sofia was worth more than any girl from a rich family he had known. And then, before that entire community that had judged Sofia so harshly, Edward stepped down from the platform, walked to where she stood, paralyzed with emotion, and knelt down. Pulled from his pocket a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Asked Sophia Miller to marry him, said he wanted to spend the rest of his life by her side, build a future together, face the world together, if she would accept. Sophia was crying. She looked around and saw faces of people who had condemned her, but she also saw Mrs. Amelia smiling with tears in her eyes, saw Mrs. Louise waving encouragingly, saw Julianne, who nodded, giving approval. And then she looked at Edward, that good man who gave her back her dignity, who fought for her when the whole world was against her, who loved her truly. The answer was obvious. She said yes, with a firm and clear voice. Yes. Edward slid the ring onto her finger, stood up and embraced her. The square exploded in applause. Not everyone applauded, some still frowned in disapproval, but many were moved by the romance unfolding before them. It was a story worthy of a book. Rich farmer defies social conventions for true love. Wronged widow finally finds redemption. It was impossible not to be moved. Reverend Vincent, who had watched everything, approached. Said he would make a point of celebrating the wedding. That it would be an honor to unite two people clearly destined for each other. Edward thanked him. They set the date for 2 months later, enough time for preparations and for the dust to settle. In the following weeks, life at Fairhaven Farm changed completely. Sofia wasn't just the seamstress anymore. She was the farmer's fiancée. Julianne began to treat her with genuine respect. The two even developed a friendship. Julianne taught Sofia about household management, how to deal with suppliers, the social rituals a farmer's wife needed to know. Sofia absorbed everything with dedication, but she also brought her own ideas. Suggested renovations in the sewing room, creation of a sewing school for the workers' daughters. Edward supported everything. Augustus was tried. With all the evidence against him, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for manslaughter. Mrs. Constance tried to use influence to reduce the sentence, but even her allies abandoned her. The truth was too heavy. The matriarch ended up moving to another town, taking her other children. She couldn't stand the shame. The wedding happened on a sunny November morning. The church was full. Half the region attended, some out of genuine affection, others out of curiosity. Sofia entered the church on the arm of Mr. Ben, who graciously accepted to represent the family she didn't have. She wore a simple but elegant white dress, which she sewed herself with Julian's help, hair loose falling in waves over her shoulders, wildflowers as adornment. She was beautiful in a natural way, without artifice. Edward waited at the altar. When he saw Sofia enter, illuminated by the light streaming through the stained glass, he felt absolute certainty. It was her. It would always be her. Reverend Vincent conducted the ceremony with visible emotion. When the moment for vows arrived, Edward and Sofia looked into each other's eyes, promised to love each other in sickness and health, in richness and poverty, until death did them part. And this time, unlike both of their previous marriages, the promises were made with a whole heart. When Reverend Vincent declared them husband and wife, Edward pulled Sofia close and kissed her. It was a tender but deep kiss, full of promises. The church applauded. The bell rang. Sofia and Edward left under a shower of rice and flowers. They entered the decorated carriage that would take them back to the farm where the reception would happen. The celebration lasted all day. There was abundant food, music, dancing. The farm workers celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. Sofia danced with Edward, with Mr. Ben, even with the Reverend. She laughed more that day than she had laughed in years. And Edward couldn't stop looking at her, as if he didn't believe his own luck. When night fell and the guests left, Edward led Sofia by the hand to the main bedroom of the house, the same room he had shared with Amelia. But Julian, realizing that would be uncomfortable, had renovated everything. New furniture, new curtains, different colors. It was a literal fresh start. Sofia entered the room and felt immense gratitude for Julian's sensitivity. Edward closed the door behind them. They looked at each other. There was no rush. They had the rest of their lives. He pulled her close, said he loved her. Sofia said she loved him too. And for the first time, they allowed themselves to be completely present, without fear, without guilt, just love. The following months were of building. Sofia took an active role in managing the farm. She wasn't just a decorative wife. She participated in decisions, gave opinions, implemented changes. The sewing shop she suggested became reality. They employed 3 seamstresses and began producing clothes that were sold in neighboring towns. The quality was so good, they soon started receiving orders from distant places. Sofia also created a program where she taught sewing to the workers' daughters, giving them a profession. Edward watched with pride as his wife transformed the farm. He took care of the grain production, she took care of the side ventures. They were true partners. They had breakfast together every day, discussing plans and dreams, dined by candlelight even after it became routine, read together in the library before sleeping, talked for hours about everything and nothing. It was a simple life in essence, but rich in happiness. Julian observed everything with satisfaction. She saw her brother truly happy. And she discovered in Sofia not just a sister-in-law, but a true friend. The two spent entire afternoons together, planning renovations, discussing recipes, sharing stories. Julian spoke of Amelia without pain, only gentle longing. Sofia listened with respect. She never tried to erase Edward's past. She just built a present alongside him. The first year of marriage brought prosperity. The wheat harvest was excellent. The sewing shop products sold well. Edward managed to pay off old debts and make new investments. They bought adjacent lands, expanding the property, renovated the workers' housing, built a small school where their children learned to read and write. Fairhaven Farm became a reference in the region, not just for production, but for the way they treated employees with dignity. Sofia found a purpose she never imagined having. She wasn't just a farmer's wife. She was a businesswoman, an educator, a community leader. The women of the region began to seek her out, asking for advice. She created a group where they met monthly to share experiences and support one another, especially women in vulnerable situations, widows, abandoned, without resources. Sofia understood their pain and did everything she could to help. Edward watched his wife grow and bloom. The initial shyness gave way to confidence. Sofia learned to speak in public, to negotiate with suppliers, to lead teams. But she never lost her essence. She remained humble, kind, hard-working, continued sewing in her spare time, not out of necessity, but for love of the art, continued reading voraciously, always learning, and continued looking at Edward with that shine in her eyes that made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. 2 years after the wedding, Sofia discovered she was expecting. The news filled the house with joy. Edward became protective to the extreme, didn't want her working too much. Sofia laughed at his concern, said pregnancy wasn't a sickness, but secretly, she loved the care. Julianne already started making the layette. Marina planned special menus. The whole farm waited with anticipation. The pregnancy went smoothly. Sofia remained active almost to the end. Only in the last weeks did she agree to slow down. Edward didn't leave her side, read to her every night, massaged her swollen feet, talked to her belly, making promises to the baby who was to come. Sofia felt loved in a way she never thought possible. On a clear spring morning, the contractions began. Mrs. Amelia, the midwife who helped Sofia find work at the farm years before, conducted the birth. Edward waited outside the room, pacing from one side to the other, nervous. Julianne tried to calm him, saying everything would go well. When they finally heard the baby's cry, Edward almost broke down the door entering. Sofia was sweaty, tired, but radiant. In her arms she held a small girl, dark hair, crying lustily. Edward approached, trembling, touched the delicate little head, looked at Sofia with tears streaming down. They had created life, together. They named the girl Clara, in honor of the farm that united them, Fairhaven. Author's note: Clara implies light, clarity. I will keep the name Clara as it works in English and links to the light she brought. Clara grew up surrounded by love. She was a joyful, curious child, running through the halls, filling everything with life. Edward was a dedicated father, taught his daughter about the crops, about the animals, about the value of honest work. Sofia taught about sewing, about reading, about kindness. Clara had the best of both worlds. 3 years later, Michael was born, a quiet, thoughtful boy who from early on showed a love for books just like his parents. The house that was once silent and melancholic now vibrated with children's laughter, running feet, games. It was exactly what Amelia would have wanted, Julianne thought sometimes, that this house would return to being a home full of joy. 5 years had passed since the wedding. It was a Sunday morning, and the whole family was gathered in the orchard. Edward and Sofia sat under the shade of a plum tree, watching Clara and Michael play. The girl, now 4, tried to teach her little brother to climb a tree. Michael, 2 years old, looked suspiciously at the branches. Edward laughed. Sofia held his hand. Julianne arrived bringing a basket with warm bread Marina had just baked. She sat with them on the grass, commented on how life had changed, how that house that seemed dead had returned to breathing. Sofia thanked her once again for Julianne having given her a chance. Julianne said it should be her thanking, that Sofia brought light back to Edward's life, and to hers too. Edward pulled Sofia closer. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They looked at their children, at the house, at the farm they built together. It hadn't been an easy path. There was prejudice, pain, injustice. But every obstacle strengthened them. Every battle won made the love more solid. Sofia sometimes thought of the girl who arrived there 5 years earlier, scared, alone, carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, that Sofia didn't believe in happy endings anymore. But she was wrong. Happy endings existed. They just came in different forms than imagined, not in perfect fairy tales, but in one fights. In love that defies conventions. In the courage to restart even when everything seems lost. Edward also reflected, thought of the man he was, 3 years after losing Amelia, closed, bitter, just surviving. Sofia didn't erase the memory of Amelia. That would be impossible, and he wouldn't want it. But she taught him it was possible to love again, that the heart has infinite capacity, that honoring the past doesn't mean staying trapped in it. The shop Sofia created now employed 15 women. It had become a prosperous business. Products were sold even in the capital. Sofia constantly refused orders, didn't want to expand too much, preferred to maintain quality. But the impact went beyond financial. Those women gained independence, supported families, taught the trade to daughters. It was the legacy Sofia was most proud of. The school they built had 20 students now. Children who before would spend their whole lives not knowing how to read had access to education. Sofia used to spend some afternoons there, teaching embroidery to the girls. Edward taught basic math. They believed education was the most effective way to transform lives. Fairhaven Farm became an example. Other properties began to copy their practices, treating workers with dignity, investing in education, creating alternative sources of income. Edward was constantly invited to give lectures at rural associations, Sofia to meetings of women entrepreneurs. The two became references, not just for financial prosperity, but for the way they achieved it without exploiting anyone. Pine Hollow changed too. With Augustus in prison and Mrs. Constance having left, the town lost its toxic matriarch. New leadership emerged. Mrs. Amelia became the region's official midwife, respected by all. Master Joe expanded his shop. The village grew in a healthy way, and people learned an important lesson. That gossip destroys lives. That judging without knowing the truth causes irreparable damage. Some even apologized to Sofia when they met her. She accepted with grace. On that sunny morning in the orchard, Sofia looked at Edward and said she was grateful. For everything. For the courage he had. For believing in her when no one else did. For fighting against the world to be together. Edward replied that it was he who owed gratitude. That Sofia saved his life just as much as he saved hers. That they were partners in this journey. Clara ran up to them asking Daddy to throw her up high. Edward got up, picked up his daughter, and began to spin with her in his arms. The girl laughed aloud. Michael wanted to also. Soon the four were running through the orchard, playing tag, laughing endlessly. Julianne watched with a full heart, thought that Amelia would be happy seeing that. Would be happy that Edward found love again. That house returned to being a home. That life continued, as it should. When the sun began to get too hot, they returned to the house. They all had lunch together at the big kitchen table. Marina had prepared roast chicken with cornbread. There was apple pie for dessert. They talked about the coming week. Edward needed to travel to close a deal. Sofia had a meeting with the seamstresses. Julianne planned to renovate the front garden. They were simple plans of a common life. But for those who went through so much, a common life was a blessing. In the afternoon, Edward and Sofia walked to the top of the property. From there, one could see the full extent of the farm, the green fields, the pastures with cattle, the White House in the center, the barns, the shop, the school, everything they built together. Edward hugged Sofia from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. They stayed like that, in comfortable silence, just absorbing the moment. Sofia thought of the woman she would be if she had never found Edward, probably still an anonymous seamstress in some house, or worse, maybe she would have given up completely. The injustice almost destroyed her, but she resisted. and at the right moment found who saw beyond the lies, who saw the truth of her heart. Edward thought of the man he would be if he never gave Sofia a chance. Probably would still be living in the past, managing the farm mechanically. Existing but not living, Sofia awakened him, showed there was beauty in the present, that the future could be built with hope. The two learned that true love isn't the fairy tale kind. It doesn't come without complications. It demands courage, demands facing prejudices, demands fighting for what one believes. But when it's real, when it's based on respect, admiration, partnership, then it's worth every battle, worth every tear, worth every scar. The sun began to go down, painting the sky orange and pink. Edward turned Sofia to face him, said he would do it all again. Every choice, every confrontation, every moment, because all paths led to her. Sofia smiled with misty eyes, said she would also do it all the same, that if the price of having that love was going through all the pain she passed, she would pay happily. They kissed there, on top of the hill, while the sun set over Fairhaven Farm. It was a kiss of promise kept, of battles won, of love that defied destiny and won. They walked down the hill holding hands, returning to the house where their children waited for them, to the life they built together, to a future that would be written in partnership. And so ends the story of Sofia and Edward, the widow everyone rejected and the farmer who had the courage to love against all odds. They proved that it doesn't matter where you come from, what mistakes were unjustly attributed to you, what weight you carried. What matters is finding someone who sees the true you, someone who fights by your side, someone who transforms survival into life. And when that happens, you discover that the most beautiful endings are those conquered with blood, sweat, and faith. They are those that prove true love always, always finds a way.